QSO Today, episode 263, John Nowacki W3NA. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, and by QRP Labs, Hans Summers, G0UPL's QRP Radio Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. I want to thank both ICOM and QRP Labs for sponsoring this episode of QSO Today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. John Nowacki W3NA was a teenager in the early 60s when he won a contest to name a popular amateur radio line of antennas that are still sold today. John shares his ham radio story that began with a friendship more than 60 years ago. Now a retired physics teacher, W3NA chases DX and shares his ham radio activities with his fellow nerds. W3NA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
Hi, Eric, 4Z1UG from W3NA. This is John.
John, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it's kind of a familiar story, at least when I talk to friends that are hams. It was something about the excitement of shortwave. And I still have a really good friend. We, I think, became really good friends like in second or third grade. And by fifth grade, we realized we had lots of things in common. And probably sixth or seventh grade, maybe somewhere along in there, his name is Mike, K8UPR. And somewhere along there, he got a gift that was a little shortwave receiver, and it was a Span Master night kit. And we listened to it. It was pretty exciting. He had to build the kit, and we listened. We thought it was pretty exciting. At the same time, then I realized that in our house we had a big old blonde console thing that was Philco or something, or RCA Victor, I can't remember what. It had a record player on one side that played 78s and I think maybe 45s, I'm not sure, but you had to put a little gizmo inside the 45 to play it. And then it had the front would fold out and there was a receiver there. And it was AM for the AM broadcast band and also some shortwave bands. So I started listening on the shortwave, and so Mike and I, we lived less than a block apart, actually. So we lived very close to each other, and so we were hung out all the time, and we were listening on each other's shortwave receivers. And then, and a little earlier, my dad and I had built a crystal radio when I was younger, and I remembered that. And things were kind of all coming together, and I was getting pretty excited. Then we realized, I don't know how we figured this out, someone must have told us, that if you hear a call sign, you can send for a card, the confirmation card, which, we know they're QSL cards. And I loved getting things in the mail. And it was just wonderful to receive those cards. And, of course, along the way, we heard ham radio operators in addition to the BBC and Radio Moscow and, all the Voice of America and all those big transmitting sites. So we were kind of excited about that, and we heard the ham radio operators, and I remember that my dad had a friend that he worked with who was not a ham but was very interested in electronics, and my parents were really supportive, I have to say. And so he took me to see his friend Ernie, and Ernie gave me a 1959, I think, handbook, and he had got a new one, and so he gave me his 59 copy. And that was my first really piece of literature that dealt with ham radio and electronics. So Mike and I together, which is, I think, really lucky to have a friend that you're sharing this passion with and this excitement about. So for me, it was Mike, K8UPR. And we got our novices within a week of each other.
What year was that?
1960. It was the summer of 1960. And so we're coming up. For the last few years, I live in Maine, and I've flown back to Columbus, Ohio, which is my hometown, and Mike still lives in the Columbus area. So I fly back, we get together, we go to the Hamvention together, and then we hang out a little bit more, and then I fly back home. And we've decided now, as we're getting a little older, we're just going to do this as a yearly ritual. Get together, have some fun, and go to the Ham Fest and come back. We don't really buy anything anymore. It's just for hanging out there and looking at new equipment and just the excitement of it being at Dayton, which, of course, now is a Greene County Fairgrounds. But so, anyways, we go back a long way. We also, every Sunday, have a schedule. So we make our initial contact on CW, and then we move to a sideband frequency that's available, and then we talk. And depending where Mike is, if he's in Columbus, then we use 40 meters. Pardon me. And if he has a place in Florida, we use 20. It works best for the propagation if we do that. So we've had this. We've done this for a long time. So we stay in contact every week, and so our roots go back together in ham radio. We both got our generals at the same exam. We did take it. Of course, you only had a year to upgrade from novice to general, and we took that at the Dayton Hamvention, and we took it at the Dayton Biltmore Hotel, which is where the convention was in 1960. Or 61 actually, when we took our exams in May of 61. It was kind of nice to have been there, and then on to the Hare Arena venue, and now to Greene County, and just to watch the size of the Hamvention grow. And it was a lot easier to get there. Of course, when I was still living in Ohio, I went to school in Ohio. I went to Miami University, which a lot of people think I'm talking about University of Miami, which is in Florida, but this is Miami University, which is in kind of southwestern Ohio, in Oxford, which is kind of north of Cincinnati and south of Dayton.
John, what was your first call sign?
My first was KN8VZU, and then when I got the general, it became K8VZU.
ZZU, right?
Victor Zulu uniform, kind of seeing what I struggled with. And it wasn't any better on CW. Well, it was a little bit better, but that Z in the middle, that was kind of a problematic thing, I always thought. And the V and the U, people miss those a lot on CW, and you miss a dit or hear an extra dit or something. But anyways, that's how it started. We were, before we became hams, we were very curious kids, and we lived in an urban area, and we lived actually in a suburb of Columbus, but it was just a few miles out of the center of Columbus, and our lot where we had our house, my parents and I, where I lived, was 40 feet wide and 80 feet deep, so there wasn't much room really for antennas, but we would get on our bicycles, and we would travel all over the place. Sometimes we would go downtown. In that case, we would take a bus, but we would explore. We would just go, we'd get on our bikes and stop at any place that looked interesting. And, of course, it doesn't take much of a stretch before, if you're interested in ham radio, you start looking for antennas. And I don't think people would do this today, but we were kids, and so we were kind of naive about protocols and how to be polite. We would just go up to the door, knock on the door, and there'd be, some guy would come to the door and go, yeah, and we'd say, oh, we see your antennas. Are you a ham radio operator? And sometimes this guy hadn't been active for years. He'd blow the dust off the equipment and fire it up and let us see it. And we did that all the time. So we were, I don't know how many different ham stations we visited that way, but it was easy because all the houses were so close together.
Would it surprise you to tell you that I do that still?
Oh, yeah, it would. But I think it's okay. It's a ham program.
Here, if I see an antenna, I'll pull over and knock on the door or ring the doorbell or push on the intercom and say, do you have a ham radio operator in there?
Yeah. I totally understand the spirit of that. I'm probably less likely to do that now. But maybe not. It would depend. Usually, I pretty much know most of the hams in this area now. But anyways, one of the people that we called on was named Jim Johnson. or Jimmy Johnson. And he was just about the exact age of Mike's father. So Jimmy Johnson was, at the time, about 53 years old, I guess. And his wife, Beulah, his call, by the way, was K8RZJ. And his wife loved flowers, so he made a QSL card that was, it had, I mean, I don't know how much this thing cost him at the time, but it had flowers on it. It had roses, zinnias, and jonquils for RZJ. And this thing had, and I think that was because his wife loved flowers, so he had that very unique-looking QSL card. They had no children. He was gone all week. He worked for Ohio Power Company. And so he'd get home, and Friday night, he'd get home, and he'd head down to the basement to his ham shack. And for many, I don't know how many times, Friday night, we would knock on the door, and they would always welcome us in. Beulah would say, "Boys, he's down in the basement." So we'd go down to the basement where he had this fantastic shack. As a novice, he had a, ICO 720, and his receiver, get this, was an SX101, which was, at that time, it was a contemporary receiver, and it was big. I think they weigh about 70 pounds. But it was very expensive. And he had this beautiful operating table he made out of plywood, and we were just stunned. And the next thing you know, he was a relatively new ham. Next thing you know, after he gets his general, he's got now the HT32A, which goes with the SX101. And there's a new tower next to his house, and he's got a TA33 on it. So we are just awestruck by this equipment. And he's so nice. He would be drinking a beer, and he would always say, "Oh, go get a Coca-Cola." And he would put Coca-Colas in this downstairs refrigerator he had for his beers, and we'd have Cokes there for us. It was so welcoming, and he was a DXer. And we were just, awestruck by the contacts he would make. He was all sideband. He didn't care for CW. But what a mentor. And he actually gave me my novice exam. And then when my DX20 didn't work, he helped me fix it. So he probably was, for Mike and I, certainly, our mentor. It was a wonderful experience. They were, what a nice couple Jim and Beulah were. Just fantastic. So.
Do you remember your first rig?
Yes. Oh, yes, I remember it well. The receiver was the not very well-known Fillmore CR5AC. Have you ever heard of one of those?
No.
Well, the only one I ever heard of was the one I had. And Joe Veras, K9OCO, several years back, came here to take some pictures of some of my older equipment. He took a bunch of pictures, and at the time he was making calendars. So one of the rigs he took a picture of is one of the months on, I forget what year it is, but one of his calendars. One of my favorite old radios. But then he wrote a book that was 50 years of amateur radio innovation, and was sold through the ARRL. And a couple of my radios are in that book, and it took years for that. I'm thinking the book didn't come out for 6 years or so after he took the pictures, or maybe 7 years. So it was, I got to tell you, when he came here and took pictures, it took the entire day. It was nice. We had, lunch for him here. He took over an entire room and set up all this camera stuff. It was so professionally done. He was very particular about how he wanted the pictures. It was I was quite impressed with Joe Veras.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. Now that field day has passed, we enter the contest season and hopefully more time to get on the air. It's time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products. Make the most of the summer and contest season with one of these great ICOM rigs. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM 7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. The rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. I purchased one myself last fall and can tell you that the ICOM 7300 is as good or better than any rig I've ever had. The ICOM IC7300 includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com or click on the banner on the QSO Today show notes page. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. So you were saying about your first rig. So it was the Fillmore,
the CR5AC, and I asked him, if he ever heard of it. He said yes, and then he sent me a card with the CR5AC picture he had taken. I think he's probably seen more rigs than anyone else on Earth, more classic rigs. He had found one, took a picture of it, and so he sent me the picture of it. I thought it was kind of funny. I could never get that receiver to work very well. I built it. It was a kit. It just didn't work well. It was, it was very frustrating. But then I built my first transmitter, which was a DX20, and it was a really great beginner transmitter. And that kind of got me started building different Heath kits. I always enjoyed building them. Anyway, so I had that in the CR5AC, and then we built kind of a little area. That was in my bedroom initially. Then we built a little area in the basement, and my dad helped me with that. And I saved up some money, and we went to downtown Columbus. Most major cities had at least one ham radio store, and ours was Universal Service, and it was owned by W8IJ, Francis Gibb, and everybody called him Gibby. He was a very interesting person, but I was always intimidated by him. But Gibby he was in charge of the store, but Dick Lytle, W8THU, really ran the store and was the manager of the store when we would go there. And he, I thought, always seemed just a little, we were kids, we were 14, 15 years old, and I always thought he was a little, didn't like kids showing up, would never buy anything.
Might not have.
Yeah, but I did go there with my $100 that I had saved and bought an HQ140X Hammerland receiver. And that was a really, really nice radio. General coverage, but it was calibrated for ham bands. It was just a really nice, great big old thing. And so I used that then with my DX20. And eventually I built a little cathode modulator that I just used a few times, but I enjoyed CW, so it didn't matter to me. But that was my rig for a long time. Then when I had my General, I got a V44 night kit VFO, which is a really nice VFO. It's a kit, and you build it, but it had a nice, stable power supply built into it. It wasn't like the VF1 that you had to steal power from the rig you were using.
Now, there's a picture on your QRZ page, which I presume was a picture of you and Mike.
Yeah.
And on your desk was a Collins radio.
Yep.
What's that about?
Well, that's a Collins KWM2. And I'm a very frugal person, Eric. And there was no way that under any normal circumstances I would have a rig like that. I mean, it was it does look out of place, and it certainly would be. One day, Mike and I were down at Universal Service, downtown Columbus, kind of poking around. We take, it must have been a Saturday, we'd go down there. And there were always brochures and things lying about, and there was a company called Neutronics out of Cleveland, Ohio. And there was a little card there. I remember seeing the card, and it was a contest, and you would fill it out. And so Mike and I each took a card, and I'm pretty sure I took mine home before I filled it out, because I can remember seeing it laying in the on a counter thing in our living room. And the idea was they were coming out with a new line of mobile antennas that you would, hook to your car. And those mobile antennas needed a name. So I thought about it, and there had been a movie that I never saw, but it was Jackie Gleason was a pool hustler. And we had a phys ed teacher where we went to high school in the suburb of Columbus. And he was a nice enough guy, but we never moved fast enough for him. So he was always saying, hustle, gentlemen, hustle, gentlemen. That was his kind of rallying call. And so I wrote down hustler and sent the thing in. And then I don't know how much longer it was, probably at least a few weeks or a month or two. I forgot all about it. I get a call on the phone, and it's Gibby, W-A-I-J. I mean, what the heck? He hardly ever gave me the time of day. He was busy with the business of it, but he was always there. He was wheelchair bound, which I thought just made it even more intimidating for a kid. But he called me and said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "No, I'm standing up." And he said, "Well, you might want to sit down." He said, "Do you remember entering this contest?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember it. It was kind of vague, and kind of vague in my mind. I actually had forgotten about it, but yeah." And he said, "Well, you won first prize." I said, "You're kidding." I said, "What is first prize?" And he told me it was a KWM2 and a set of, which now are known as Hustler antennas. And eventually it wasn't just that individual antenna. They had a whole line, and so it kind of became Hustler antennas. So I'm the namesake of. Have you heard of Hustler?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, well, I now have the byline for this episode.
Yeah.
The man that named Hustler.
Yeah, and then there was a CQ magazine came out later where they had a whole page ad, and they had my picture on it, the winner. But I was a kid, I was maybe 16 years old when that happened. So.
Right, but that was like 1963. What do you think that KWM2 is worth in 1963? What do you think it sold for?
I'm not sure, but I didn't have it more than about a year or so. And then I was going to go to college, and so I thought, let's sell this to kind of help pay for college, which I did. So I was back to the old stuff. And I don't want to, make anyone mad, but my opinion is, my experience is that the KWM2 is not really a very good CW rig. It's great for sideband. Collins was certainly a great innovator in sideband equipment, but it's not so great on CW. So it wasn't like a big loss to me to not have the KWM2 anymore. So, anyways, that was I'm as I look back on it, I really liked the idea that I actually won a major contest, and I actually named something. And gee, the company's still in business. It's still actually it's still called Neutronics Antennas, and it's still in Cleveland, I believe. And
Hustler, the Hustler brand, is still out there 60 years later, or almost 60 years later. Yeah.
Well, every time when I see one, I think to myself, I named that antenna. So, anyways, that was pretty exciting for a kid. I haven't really won anything since. I think I might have won a call book at a Hamvest or something.
What's the current rig?
Well, right now I have two. Well, I have more radios than most people should have. I really like a lot of rigs, and some are a little older. I thought that the TS-830S was one of the best radios I ever owned. I had two of those at one time. I don't have either one of them now. And for a long time, I used Kenwood Twins, R599D and the T599D. I thought those were splendid rigs. But right now, I have what I consider to be, for my taste, the best radio I've ever owned, and that's a Yaesu FTDX 5000. And I just love how signals sound in it. At first, I was intimidated by all the knobs, but I eventually got over that and figured out how to use the ones that I really use. And I just love that radio. The little scope that came with it was stereo speakers. The speakers are nice, but the scope is practically useless. It's not nearly like scopes on even ICOM radios. I think those are pretty good. I had owned an ICOM 7600 before this, and I also had an FTDX 3000 before this, and I sold both of those to buy the used. Of course, I always just buy used because I'm frugal. But that's my main radio. Now, I also have a radio that I like very much, but it's completely different. I have a Flex 6500, and I got to say I am totally in love with the looking at things on a screen with that Flex. I have a 21-inch monitor, I think, that I use with that. The downside of it is that I had to buy a PC because I wanted to use the software that is native written for Flex, and that's written for a PC for Microsoft, for Word.
For the Microsoft operating system, like Windows 10, Windows 7, yeah.
Yes, and that's exactly what I'm using. I'm using Windows 10. I don't care for it. All our computers here since the mid-'80s have been Apple computers. And there is a native Apple system you can buy, and I just wasn't as comfortable with it, believe it or not, as I am with the PC version. So I managed to, struggle around and finally get Windows 10 to work on this inexpensive computer I bought. And, I got to say that the Flex operating system works very well on that. And I'm totally in love with the visual part. I connect with that really, really easily. It was very easy for me to adjust. Some people like the knobs. But I don't feel that the receiver on the Flex and controlling some of the controls like volume and things like that you want to jump and just turn a knob for, they're sliders. And the code speed the same way. It's very, very frustrating for me to use those sliding things with a mouse. So recently I've got a Flex control. I haven't hooked it up yet. We'll see how that goes.
Now, the software for the Flex is what, the Power SDR software?
Yes, that's right. I think it's Smart SDR now.
There are both choices there.
Right. They changed when they went to the 6000 series radios. They went from whatever it was, I think, to Smart SDR now. And it's nice. I'm still using version 1, a high number of version 1, and now I think I know they've come out with a version 2. I haven't bought it. It's a couple $100, and I think they might even have a version 3 now. But the version 1 worked really well for what I wanted to do. I was even able to set it up on FT8 because I wanted to see what that was like. And I made, a few dozen QSOs on FT8 and realized that I guess if there was a DXpedition and I wanted to work somebody, I would have to figure out how to use the DX mode on it. But in general, I didn't feel it was as fun for me as like a CW QSO would be. So
I just got a 7300 in October at the Pacificon show, and I have to tell you, I agree with you. I love seeing the spectrum. I never had anything where I could see the spectrum before, and I love that waterfall display and seeing if the band's active and what's going on there. It's really amazing. It's
an incredible tool, and if you can imagine seeing that then projected on a 21-inch monitor like it is with my Flex 6500, and when you want to, you see some QRM, and you hear it on your on the signal you're listening to.
Right.
Well, you see that adjacent signal, and then you just take the mouse and you click on the edge. There's a little darkened area,
right,
kind of a gray area that goes over the signal. It shows you your received bandwidth. You just take the corner of it and crank it in a little bit towards the signal, and the one on the side disappears because now it's out of the bandpass of your.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really amazing.
And in a DX pileup, it's really great. You can see all the signals bouncing up and down. And when someone comes back with a normal radio, I'm scouting around on my second VFO, trying to find the station that's coming back to the DX operator, trying to see some kind of pattern that the DX operator is following and making QSOs. And it's really hard because sometimes I write down frequencies real fast and I try to see which way things are moving where I'm listening. But this, you can see the signal pop up. It's almost like, I hate to even mention it here because it's such a wonderful technique for DXing. And it's once you see it and you get used to using the visual information, which is now available. It's a game changer, and I love it. So I'm kind of stuck. I'm thinking of maybe building a little, some kind of SDR receiver that I can put into the IF input in the FTDX 5000. I know some people have done that, and then I would have that, but I wouldn't really have the convenience of the mouse to control what I want to do on the screen. So I'm stuck in this. I can't decide. There's another nice thing about the 5000, and that is it is a 200-watt radio. And I found that when I'm running barefoot at 100 watts, you would think if you double your power to 200 watts, it should be no big deal. It's not even half
3
of
dB.
a dB, but it makes a difference. To me, I can feel a difference with it. So it's half an S unit, 3 dB. So it's.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. So your favorite operating mode is CW. Are you a contester?
No. And the reason for that is that I can't move fast enough, either mentally or physically typing on a keyboard, to be competitive in anything other than like field day. I guess is kind of a contest, and that's fun. But when we go out, we do pretty well under one transmitter, but we don't shoot for we're going to get the highest score we've ever got or anything like that. We do it as kind of a combination social event and operating event. There's a caveat there, and that is there is one contest that I can be competitive in, and that is the CQ Magazine DX Marathon. And as it's kind of described, it is a marathon. The contest lasts for 1 year, and you work as many different countries in as many different zones, CQ zones, the WAZ zones for CQ Magazine's worked all zones, 40 of them, as you can in 1 year. So I decided, now this is a contest, because I kind of plug away at things. That's how I get by. So I thought maybe I got a chance at this, and it was in 2014, I thought, I'm going to give this a try. So right about March, it dawned on me to try this. So I did, and I looked up to see what last year's winter's scores had been, and I realized that if I used 10 meters, the year before, 2013, a Swedish amateur radio operator had it was pretty low. Total score of 220 or 230. And I decided to do single band, 10 meters. And so I think I can break that score and do better. And I got off to a good start in March, and I realized, I had, by the time the end of the year came around on 10 meters, I had a total score that was about 300. I thought, well, geez, I got 60 more than the guy who won last year. So I was really excited, sent all this stuff in. The results come back. I'm number 2. PY5EG is number 1. Who's this person? So I looked him up on QRZ, and he has this big contest station, and evidently he's won this DX marathon on several different bands, and evidently he hadn't won it on 10 meters yet. I didn't have my strategy down I know contesters have strategies now, so I was very disappointed, and I thought, this took a whole year to do this. Every time I spotted a new station or I heard a new station, it took a lot of time, and it almost wore me out. So I thought, well, I'll give it one more shot. So in 2015, the propagation was starting to deteriorate, and 10 meters wasn't as good as it had been. So I started the contest, and I thought, I'm going to do 15 meters and 10, and after a couple months, we'll see which one looks like it's going to work the best. I also checked, and PY5EG had already won 15 meters. So I knew, he's not going to be working on 15 single band again, and he's already won 10, so either one of these bands would work for me. And so that was my thinking on the whole thing. And so I ended up that 15 meters was giving me a lot more contacts than 10 was. So I just stayed on 15, turned in my score, and I did win in 2015 the DX Marathon for single band 15 meters. And after that, I thought, that's enough. I'm totally exhausted with contesting. That's my contesting story.
Which ham radio award is the most meaningful? Would you think that is? Or do you have another one?
I thought at the time it was meaningful, and it was, because it was a goal I had to win a contest, so that was kind of good. I think probably the DXCC award is still the one that's the most meaningful to me. And I'm sitting here 2 countries shy of working every country in the world. And Crozet Island, which would be, if there's someone on the air there, I have good propagation in that direction. And the other is North Korea, and that is really difficult propagation-wise, and obviously politically, it's very difficult to have an operator there. So I'm not, thinking that I will, as much as I would love to work all the countries on the DXCC list, the North Korea one looks like I'm not counting on that ever happening. So it's a little sad, but it would be great if I could work those 2 and, have, the final, everything wrapped up in the DXCC. And there's at least a few thousand people that have done that, and I would really like to. So that, I think, my favorite accomplishment in terms of awards is still yet to happen if I can, finish the DXCC.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I think so.
You mentioned that you went to Miami University.
I did.
What did you study there?
Physics. My senior year, I took physics in high school, and I thought, boy, I really enjoy this. This is fun. We're doing experiments. The chemistry experiments were fun, but the physics experiments were more fun for me. And, of course, the electricity part of it I loved. And so I thought, well, maybe I want to be a physics teacher. Up until that point, I had wanted to be an architect. But I thought, this physics teaching things looks like it's fun. So I went to Miami thinking that I wanted to be a physics teacher. And after I got my bachelor's degree somebody in the physics department there contacted me and asked me if I'd ever thought about, a graduate degree, and if I was, I should, talk to them, because they had a master's degree program there. So I talked with them and thought, well, why not? And then I got thinking about it and thought, if I don't like teaching and I want to do some research, it would be probably nice to have the master's degree. So just about as I was ready, this was summer of '68, and I was preparing to go to graduate school the next year. I went to my draft board and found out I was going to be drafted. So I was very fortunate. I managed to join U.S. Army Reserve Unit, and so for the next 6 years I was, in the Army Reserves, but it only took 6 months out of my life for the basic training and the advanced training, and then I was able to come home. And, I think almost every day about how fortunate that was for me that I, did not get drafted because I enlisted, and we never got activated for Vietnam. And I was in several different units. They were all hospital units. One of them units was in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and that unit was a ambulance train. So if you can imagine, it's a train that, has accommodations for sick and wounded, but our train was in Germany, in mothballs, evidently, so we never got to train on our train.
Actually, I've never heard of a hospital train.
Yep, I think it was for our nomenclature was called hospital train rail. That's how it was described by the Army. And that group, we only had 22 people in that reserve unit, and then they kind of had a program of limiting small units, so we got moved to a unit that was in Sharonville, Ohio, very near Mason, Ohio, where the Voice of America transmitters were. And also radio station WLW has a huge antenna there and our 50,000-watt transmitter on 700 AM. But the Voice of America, I was then a teacher, because I went ahead and became a teacher, and I was teaching in Cincinnati, and we had our little radio club, and so we managed to be able as a club to go and visit the Voice of America transmitters. They gave us a wonderful tour of the facility, the transmitters, out looking at the antennas and everything. The antennas were breathtaking. They were 700-foot towers, and they went on for acres and acres, and they had this big switching block thing that was huge. It was outdoors, and they pulled these big poles down, and it looked like a switching station, in a substation somewhere for, an electric generating plant, but it was just for their antennas. I loved that tour. I'll never forget the tour of that Voice of America transmitter. Now it's been, I believe the towers are all torn down. It's been decommissioned, but I think there is a little museum there, and I think there's also a radio club that does something there in Mason, Ohio, at the Voice of America transmitting site.
We were speaking before we pushed the record button a little bit about how being a ham is different, and as you're speaking about these beautiful antennas, I can only imagine myself visiting there with my wife and saying, "Look, aren't these antennas? They're amazing. They're absolutely gorgeous," and her shaking her head and saying, "Yeah, yes, dear." So only hams can appreciate the beauty of these antennas.
Well, it is a funny thing. They are quite beautiful, and I got to say, I've never seen antenna arrays since then. I actually visited up in Nova Scotia, another transmitting site run by Canadians. It's a shortwave broadcasting site, and my son and I, who was 15 at the time, had decided to go. I decided to go, and he's a ham. He's N1SKW. He's not active now, but he still has his ticket. And he was just a kid, like 15 or 16. So we decided it would be a fun adventure if we did a de-expedition. But at the time, I was really afraid of flying. Luckily, since then, I've become much more comfortable flying. But I didn't want to fly anywhere. So I thought, where's a country that you can access, you don't have to fly to, that you could just drive to, basically, that's kind of a neat DX location. So it's not really Canada or Mexico. So we went to St. Pierre and Miquelon, and I got a license from the French government to use FP stroke. At the time, my call sign was AD1E, and so we went up there. We drove all the way up through Maine, and then across into Canada, and as we were going across Nova Scotia, when we came back, that's where we saw the broadcast station. But then we went into Newfoundland and drove kind of a little bit north, and then all the way across, and then came down south, because it's like the southeast corner is where St. Pierre is located. And it's a short ferry ride to get to it. But when you get there, it is a different world. It's just like being in France. And I have been in France, and they were so similar. The architecture and the narrow streets, it was really fun. The only downside is that neither of us spoke French, but there were people there that did speak English. So we had a hotel reservation. We put up a metal post and hung some dipoles from it. And I had taken my Kenwood twins, the T599 and the R599, and had them in this big backpack, and they weighed a ton. We had our coax and everything, and we operated for about 6 or 7 days, I guess, and then took the ferry back to the mainland and drove all the way home. That was my one and only DXpedition.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. It's my understanding that you were a physics teacher for many years. Did you ever leave teaching for the private sector, or did you remain a teacher throughout your career?
Well, I did. I taught for 9 years, 3 of those in Ohio, and then I moved to Maine, and 6 years teaching here in Kennebunk, actually. And I realized that, we had purchased a house, but we bought a house that had been actually deserted, so I had to, rewire it, replumb it, and do all these things, and everything was costing money, and the teaching salary just wasn't enough. And as I might have mentioned before, I'm kind of a frugal person, so when my wife's parents gave us their car, it was so rusty that the dealer wouldn't take it as a trade-in, but they gave it to us, and I had to put new fenders on the Ford Pinto. I thought, this has got to change. So I started looking for a job that would be in industry where I could use my physics degrees. And eventually, I got a job with Sprague Electric Company. I didn't even realize they had, well, at the time, it was the world's largest, in Maine, believe it or not, in Sanford, Maine, the world's largest solid tantalum capacitor factory. And I interviewed with them, and they hired me as what was called a product engineer at the time. And there were probably 8 project, maybe not 8, maybe 6 product engineers, and we had an engineering manager. And then we had process engineers, and there were about 6 of those folks, I guess, and they had a manager. And we designed and were in charge of the process in this big capacitor plant of creating solid tantalum capacitors. And I have to tell you, it is part science and part art, at least it was for us when we were making those capacitors there. It was for a high-pressure industrial environment. We started 10 million capacitors every week. It was really a wonderful place to work. The layers of management were very few. So the vice president of all tantalum operations in the world, his office was right in our big plant. We had 1,200 employees actually. And he would walk through that plant. He was a past engineer, and he would talk with engineers. He'd talk with plant workers. and the plant manager was the same way. Everybody worked together. It was a wonderful, wonderful machine. It was, in its way, it was very casual in terms of who you could talk to about different problems, and I think that's why that particular plant was so incredibly successful. For the Sprague Electric Company, they had many, many different product lines that were not tantalum capacitors. They had they had wet tantalums. Those, of course, were tantalums, but a different product line. And they had all sorts of semiconductors they were building and different equipment. It was, it started in the 20s, actually, by R.C. Sprague. And then the president became John Sprague. And by the way, he's written a book about his experience at Sprague Electric. It's called The Rise and Fall of Sprague Electric. But I eventually left there after 7 years and realized that I'd made enough money that I did have several jobs there. I got involved in the management of the operation, which paid a lot better than engineering. I was head of all the engineering eventually. And so when I left there, I realized that I could leave, go back to teaching, and never have to work another summer. That I'd been able to, save that much money in my frugal ways, and my wife's frugal ways too. So I went back to teaching. I went to a place called Noble High School, and that turned out to be a wonderful adventure because there was a big change for education and how we taught, and we were able to participate in the design of a fantastic high school, the best high school in the state of Maine as far as I'm concerned. It was broken up into educational pods. We worked as a group of teachers. I loved it. It was a wonderful way to spend the next 26 years. And then I finally retired from that, and now I have more time for ham radio. So that's how I was in education, left it to go to industry, and then went back to education ultimately.
Well, you're a frequent contributor to QST Magazine. You caught my attention last May in an edition where you had an article called The Golden Age of Radio. What is the Golden Age of Radio, and how did that project start?
Well, there's a really nice small museum here in Kennebunk, Maine, called the Brickstorm Museum. And they have some displays that are on all the time, and then they have special displays that will go for 3 months or 4 months at a time. And they had something that they were going to have as a show called Collecting. And so they had a lot of people bring in things that they collected. And so my friend here in town, AI2Q, his name is Alex, and we've been friends for quite a long time, and we both love CW, and we both have quite a few keys between the two of us, actually, telegraph keys. And so we thought, well, we collect telegraph keys. Why don't we do that? So we went up and talked to them and said, when you do this, would you consider telegraph keys? They said, sure. So they had this really nice case that we put our telegraph keys in and had little descriptions of them and how old they were and what they were used for. And then we kind of got to know the curator there and the person who runs it, operator. They were really, really nice. And we would talk about radio, and they said, your key collection got a lot of attention, especially from men. And we said, well, would you ever want to do something that's, more about radio, maybe history of radio, because we have a lot of old radios between the two of us. And they said, well, we're going to do some research. So they did, and they came up with this golden age of radio. And so we got a whole one of the 3 main rooms in the museum they turned over to us, and so we did research, wrote descriptors for everything, and we had an IP500 and matching amplifier and the tuning unit that goes with it. We had a spherical Audion, a DeForest one. We had radios from probably 1915 right up on through 1929. We limited it to that. We talked with them about, what is the golden age of radio, so we tried to limit that. And we set up a Morse key, and people could come in and send Morse code with a little code oscillator. And then during this thing, there was an evening where we were asked to do a presentation about the whole thing. So they set up chairs, and Alex and I went in and did a little talk about these different radios and what it must have been like when there was. I have a spark transmitter, and that was there. It's probably about 3.5 feet long, and it's got a beautiful, beautiful greeby synchronous spark wheel. It's probably got a diameter of, I don't know, a foot maybe, and it had the original motor that goes with the thing. It's quite a I think it's quite a beautiful piece. So that was there. We were able to talk about the early spark that amateurs did, and how pretty much everybody on the radio was an amateur back in the teens and 20s. It was really a lot of fun, and that was a really well-received exhibition. And they loved it because it brought a lot of males in, and usually they just have female visitors, so they were very excited about that. So that's how the golden age of radio came about.
Now, you're a member of NERDS, N-E-R-D-S. We all know what nerds are, although this sounds like this is a different kind of nerd. What is NERDS, and what do they do?
Well, we're really not all that different. No, it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of appropriate. It's the New England Radio Discussion Society, and the first letter of those words spell out nerds. About 8 years ago, Alex, AI2Q, who's always been pretty social with a wide range of ham radio operators, thought, wouldn't it be, there have been several clubs in our area, and they kind of come and go. And he thought, wouldn't it be fun to have a club where we focused on learning about things and maybe presentations, more than business meetings, and in fact, maybe no business meetings at all. So he talked to me and said, what do you think of this idea? And I said, I think it sounds great. He said, will you come to this first meeting we have? He said, yeah. So he talked to a lot of hams, and we had a lot of hams show up. I'd say we had maybe 15 people showed up at that first meeting. And we had a little talk. Alex did a little talk about antennas and feed lines, I remember. And I had supplied a bunch of resources that I handed out a sheet that was different books you could use for antenna design and learning about antennas. And I thought it was a lot of fun. And then we did a few more, and I did a presentation on building a crystal radio. When I was a physics teacher, one of the projects we did is all my students built their own crystal radio out of wire and wax paper and aluminum foil, basically. So they had to figure out how big the capacitor would be, how they wanted to tune it. Then they had to wind the coil, and we used diode detectors for them, and I had a big long wire antenna. So it really wouldn't have to be a very good receiver to hear something with that big long wire antenna. But anyway, so we did that. All the hams in the Nerds group did that one evening. It was just a lot of fun. And then we changed venues a couple times. Right now, we do meet in Kennebunk. And ever since that first meeting, I think we've probably done now 8 field days together. So it's been probably 8 years that this club has been together. And we have a mailing list of almost 90 people. I'll be happy to add you to the mailing list. And we usually we meet twice a month. And one of those meetings is like a show and tell, when people bring in things they've worked on, and then we talk about them and kind of just talk about how interesting that is. And then the other meeting is usually a more formal presentation where someone in the group will present things. It can be antennas, it can be feed lines, it can be just all sorts of, to me, really, really exciting things about DXing, how to use, digital communications, and usually it's a lot of stuff that I don't know, so it's always interesting to me. And so that's what the New England Radio Discussion Society is about, and I think that the name New England Radio Discussion Society is really a good descriptor. We don't have business meetings. We don't have any dues. You don't have to be a member of this group. And so that gives us a lot more time to focus on what we enjoy, which is learning about ham radio stuff and sharing, what we know with other people in the group.
Now, I notice on the Nerds website that there's an electronics for amateur radio section. So has Nerds become a purveyor of information to non-hams in order to get people into ham radio?
Yeah, and also that was Alex had taught an electronics course somewhere, and so he thought, and we all thought, we had some newer members, and at the time they were technician class operators, and they were always feeling like what we talked about, they didn't have a good base of understanding for, some of the presentations we were doing. And so the nerds decided that, well, maybe we should do an electronics program. So Alex gathered the stuff he had for the presentation, and then another ham, George, I hope I have his W1BOF, I think, and I would we went to all the classes too, and they were on a different night from the regular nerds meeting. And we probably had 10 people that took that. A couple were not hams, but most of them were hams, and even though they had passed the exam, they didn't feel like they really knew what was going on. It was a wonderful course, actually. It went from the simplest to fairly sophisticated things, and I think everybody who took it got a lot out of the course. I loved hearing all the stuff. Some of the stuff I knew, some of the stuff I had forgotten, so it was a good relearning experience for me, too. Should we get another newer group that expresses the same concerns, we would probably not hesitate in teaching that again. In fact, we offered that course to anybody. We announced it at local high school. If there'd be anybody interested in this electronics course, it's completely free. It's in the evening. But the only takers we really got were people who were really interested in ham radio.
Well, I actually went through the course before I interviewed you, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes page for people that want to have a basic electronics course, either to review or to even give with yours and Alex's permission. Perhaps they can actually use that and give you credit for having done it. But it's really good. The visuals are good. It has some quizzes. It has some homework. I think it's really a great course.
Well, that's all Alex's work, and I have to say that Alex is very generous in the time he puts into ham radio, and he is another, like many of us, he just loves this hobby, and he's very, very savvy technically, and he's remarkable in that I've never known a person who can memorize people call signs so quickly. He remembers everybody's name and call sign, whether he met them, 10 minutes ago or 50 years ago. It's incredible. So I've never seen anything like it. He's really remarkable. And I thought that, going back and working on this, even to having the idea of we should have a group like Nerds, and we don't really have a president or vice president, but Alex kind of takes it on to send out the announcements. We've got a Nerds meeting this week.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, when I got really busy with family life, there were periods in my amateur radio career where I did no ham radio at all. Equipment was packed up, no antennas, and that's happened a few times in the almost 60 years I've been a ham. And I think that it's like anything else, but when I came back to it each time, it had changed some, and the operating procedures were different, which was kind of a surprise to me. But I always came back and always enjoyed it, but I pretty much came back to CW, which is the thing that I like the most. And I don't know why, maybe it connects me with the earliest operators in amateur radio. I really love, from like this golden age of radio, I love the equipment. I also have kind of a hobby of collecting early amateur radio equipment as well as some early broadcast and wireless equipment. And there's something about those items there from a point of view of both just the artistic look and the connection with the technology. These are items of beauty to me, the old radios. It's almost frightening. I think I'm really kind of goofy, and so it's good I'm in a group called the Nerds. But I see that same thing when someone in Nerds restores, let's say, a piece of World War II radio equipment. they will bring that in and talk about what they've done. We'll look at the things they've done to replace capacitors and whatever they've done. They brought it back to life, and they are so excited about that. And it just makes me more comfortable to be very excited about the parts of our hobby that I love. I think ham radio, first of all, for me, is a hobby of my lifetime. There's nothing that compares. And I think there are so many different ways you can go with amateur radio that you could not do it in a lifetime. You couldn't really learn everything there is to do in amateur radio in a lifetime. I think that's one of the attractions. I've known people that only operated slow-scan television. That's all they were interested in. Well, I understand that. I'm not interested in it, but I understand how they would be. And have you noticed that, Eric, in the conversations you've had?
Absolutely. There are people that have stayed in the same groove. On the one hand, on the other hand, I'm often surprised to hear people that have been in a groove for a long time, and then all of a sudden they find something else and they switch. So there's something for everyone. The tent is really big now, and I think the fact that we're all online also helps to introduce hams who've been in a groove for a long time, like CW or single sideband, to other modes and other ways of being a ham. Let me ask you, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
Well, most people, I would believe, think it's having it survive by increasing the number of hams. And there's always the talk about, well, we shouldn't water down the tests, and we shouldn't do this, and we should do that. I'm not sure. It's like anything else. It's in flux. It's changing, and it's changing more quickly now as a hobby than it was. When they dropped the CW requirement, that was a big blow to a lot of people, and they thought that would be the end of amateur radio, CW. But what I've noticed is a lot of the people that, at least in our little nerds group here, the people that are interested in ham radio are not kids anymore, like we were when we started. They're older adults. And I've noticed, and someone you interviewed made this observation too. I'm just going to repeat it. I think it might have been K4ERO, John. Is that right? But somebody mentioned that there's a difference for adults trying to learn Morse code than it is for kids. It appears, at least what I've seen, it is much more difficult for adults to learn the code, because we've had several members that didn't have to take a code test but really wanted to work CW, and it's been a lot harder for them to do that, and they're still plugging away at it. I got to give them credit for this. They have a group. They meet every week. There's 3 people, kind of a subgroup of the nerds, and they work on their CW together, and then they meet on the air on Thursdays and do the same thing, and they keep plugging away at it. It's remarkable how determined they are, but it's obvious to me that it's much harder when you're older, so I'm thankful that I learned it when I was a kid.
Well, I think learning a foreign language is also difficult as an adult. I have grandchildren that speak 3 languages, and they do it, rather fluidly. And I've frankly been struggling learning a foreign language for 20 years, and I haven't mastered it. And I think if I was much younger, it would come to me as easily as it does to my grandchildren. So I think that you're right. I think it's like riding a bicycle when you learn CW as a kid. I haven't operated CW for 45 years on the one hand. On the other hand, I still remember all the letters, and if it's low enough, I recognize what's being said. So, what can you do? I think you're right. I think it is about the age. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I do like that the new modes, like FT8, for example, that one is particularly popular, are popular for a lot of hams. And if for some older hams, we might not enjoy that as much. But I look at it as it's bringing a lot of excitement to hams. A lot of people are enjoying it. It's just another facet of ham radio. And so I think it's a very good thing, actually, that FT8 and the other modes whether it's RTTY or FT8 or FT9 or any what might come of the other parts of the whisper, for example, which is mostly listening, I guess. These are wonderful things, and people that are interested in them, I think, is great for our hobby because it keeps people active. It's I don't like it when someone gets a license and then they kind of fall away from the hobby. It's like they've been all trained, but they've kind of fallen away. If you can reactivate that person, then that's a lot easier than starting with someone who's never done anything in ham radio.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
Oh, I would say, I would say, which is, I've changed my mind about this, but I would say find a group of hams somewhere. Find a group like our nerd group, for example, or there are other radio clubs in this area that are more traditional clubs. Find a group. Find other hams. Get connected with other hams. I think that's really a key. For me, having this really good friend, Mike, that we did all this early amateur radio stuff together, and there were other hams that we did know in the area, and of course many of the hams that we stopped in on. I had been a Boy Scout, and one of the other Boy Scout guys had a ham radio license, K8VYN, Dave, and then he had a friend, K8VYL, Dan Vincent, and so I knew Dave through Boy Scouts, Mike knew me, Dave knew Dan, and so the four of us would get together and do ham radio stuff, and that was even more fun. So if you can get other hams around you, don't try to do this solo, is what I would recommend.
Mm. John, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about ham radio and have this QSO on QSO today. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Well, thank you, Eric. It was fun. I can't believe the time has flown by so fast. 7-3.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W3NA in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.